It is so wonderful to see you all here tonight, and those of you who are listening from home. I am so fortunate to be the one to welcome Frida Kahlo Beyond the Myth to the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts. Frida is finally here. This beautiful exhibition was organized by Sue Canterbury, the Pauline Gill Sullivan Curator of American Art, and Dr. Augustine Ortega, the former Eugene McDermott Director at the Dallas Museum of Art. And it has been a privilege to install this extraordinary selection of work by Frida Kahlo and her contemporaries at the VMFA. From the thoughtful exhibition design by Mike Kanasek and his team, as well as the graphic design by Annie Wright and the wonderful signature animation by Shannon Baker, which you'll see at the first thing you see in the exhibition, and the dramatic lighting by Amber Smith and her team, as well as the art handling team led by Eric Steiner and registration by Kelly Powell. Last but certainly not least is the ringleader, the exhibition coordinator, Megan Carter, who made sure that everything happened on time and at the highest possible quality. The team here at the VMFA is a pleasure to work with, and I'm so fortunate that I had the support of such talented and committed people. Thank you so much. We are now so familiar with the gaze of Frida Kahlo. She looks out from her paintings with both strength and vulnerability. It is this memorable gaze that is perhaps the reason why her paintings have had such enduring impact and wide appeal, and why her fame has only grown exponentially in the years since her death in 1954. Most of us can relate to the need to project outward power in the moments of inner weakness, but this effect was carefully orchestrated by Kahlo herself. Throughout her life, she was the architect of her own persona. In her self-portraits, she seems both earthbound and ethereal, her half-figure clad in costumes and jewelry that seem at once both humble and regal. Despite her fame and icon-like status, Kahlo herself is clothed in mystery and myth, and she carefully composed and controlled her outward persona. This, I would say, is perhaps her greatest work of art. The performative aspect of her work is often overlooked and is an important theme of this exhibition that I hope runs throughout as you walk through those galleries. She was always in control of her outward appearance, both in her own work and when she was the subject of other artists' depictions of her. Only rarely, often in the hands of close, trusted friends, usually female friends, do we see Kahlo let down her guard and we get a more intimate, personal glimpse of the artist. One of the best examples of her trust and intimacy with this close-knit circle is the unguarded and introspective 1944 portrait of Kahlo by Sylvia Salmi, which greets visitors to this exhibition. This is the Frida we hope to reach, introspective, unguarded, yet prepped and ready with her armor of costume, flowered hair, as if steeling herself to turn and look at the camera with her unforgettable gaze. Compare this to the carefully orchestrated image by Nicolas Mouret. This was a collaborative effort. Frida chose her clothes, jewelry, hair, but the vibrant colors and dramatic lighting, and certainly that familiar gaze, evokes Frida's own painted self-portraits. The contrast between the real Frida, the one behind closed doors, and the carefully constructed image is on view in these galleries. Despite her position as one of the most documented artists of the 20th century, these dichotomies and contradictions make Frida Kahlo an elusive figure, clouded by mythology that was mostly of her own making. The most concrete example I know of a self-invoked myth is Kahlo's claim to have been born in 1910, but in fact was born on July 6, 1907 in Coyoacan, a suburb of Mexico City. Now, who among us cannot relate to wanting to shave a few years off of our age? But this, I would argue, is not why she did this. It was very important for her to align her birth date with the date of the Mexican Revolution. And this says two things about how she is constructing her identity. First, that her Mexican identity was extraordinarily important to her. And second, her identity as a political figure was also very important to her. Her life was punctuated by illness and adversity, beginning with polio at the age of 6, which left her with a permanent limp. In 1925, a streetcar collided with the bus that she was riding on in a devastating accident that left her with numerous broken bones and serious internal injuries that led to lifelong physical challenges. Yet she adapted fashions and styles that would allow her to hide these injuries behind affectation and embrace her Mexican and indigenous background. She began to paint during her recuperation. Her injuries, surgeries, and the lifelong pain she endured would inform her subsequent works, many of which are filled with complex symbolism related to specific incidents in her life. Even the artwork she created, which expressed her emotive responses to these powerful events, sometimes hinder our understanding of Kahlo as an individual, as she constructed a persona of imposing characteristics, seductive and innocent, strong and vulnerable, glamorous and earthy. In Frida Beyond the Myth, it is precisely the myth and the evolution of it that we hope to understand. Where does it come from? How did Frida construct her persona, and why? I'm showing you here the first room of the exhibition, in which we see this animated signature that will morph throughout her life and change, and we see this on a loop, so we can understand that she evolved not just as a person, but also as an artist throughout her life. This exhibition is organized into 6 sections. It's organized chronologically, and so each of these sections is devoted to an era of her life. We also have included an illustrated timeline to give visitors the tools that they need to understand the pertinent events that framed her life. But you'll also see that there is a conceptual framework of this exhibition, and one that informed the beautiful design executed by the VMFA's design team. And it's Frida Kahlo's literal and spiritual home, the Casa Azul. This is the place where she was born, she lived, she worked, and she died. The vibrant colors and dynamic architecture of the galleries is inspired by this place where Frida felt most herself, safe and protected and supported. By now, I know that many of you perhaps know her life story, or at least a bit of it, both fact and fiction combined rather well. For some of you, her biography and perhaps her paintings will be new to you. Today, I will examine Kahlo's self-constructed identity against the backdrop of her lived experience by examining the chronology and the themes of the exhibition. And along the way, I will hope to explore the importance of her embrace of a Mexican and indigenous background, which were often conflated by herself and her critics, and her identity as a fiercely independent woman, to understand how Frida proposed her constructive persona as armor and security against a world that wanted to see her as a wife, as disabled, and as a victim. At times, Kahlo chose to perform different aspects of her identity, including nationality, ethnicity, sexuality, and disability. And often, in response to challenges of her autonomy, and in the oversized looming shadow of her husband, the great Mexican muralist Diego Rivera. Kahlo was born the third of 4 daughters, as Magdalena Carmen, Frida Kahlo y Calderon, on January 6, 1907, in Coyoacan, Mexico, to Matilde Calderon and Guillermo Kahlo. Her mother, Matilde, was mestizo with a Spanish and indigenous background. Her father was a German emigre who became a Mexican national and later Hispanicized his name from Wilhelm to Guillermo. Guillermo was a professional photographer specializing in landscape and architectural photography, and throughout Frida's life, he provided an example of a successful career as an artist. He also suffered from epilepsy, and Frida also looked to him as an example of strength and resilience in the face of physical challenges. Because of his illness, The young Frida would assist him in his studio and accompanied him when he went out on landscape assignments. She would later say, "Many times when he went walking with his camera on his shoulder and me by the hand, he would suddenly fall. I learned to help him during these attacks in the middle of the street. On the one hand, I would make sure that he immediately breathed alcohol or ether. And on the other, I watched so that his camera case would not be stolen." Years later, Frida wrote in her diary, "My childhood was marvelous because although my father was a sick man, he was an immense example to me of tenderness and of work, and above all, understanding for all my problems." The effects of her childhood polio seemed to bond her to her father. Frida became Guillermo's favorite, and he encouraged her interest in art and art history, even though early on her ambition was to study medicine. And this is one of the important themes of this exhibition, is the household that she grew up in gave her this example of work, but in work as an artist. But also, if you look at Guillermo's photography, it provides a format of a very still, serious, posed portraiture. As the daughter of a professional photographer, Kahlo was accustomed to posing in front of the camera. In the earliest photographs of Kahlo by her father, she appears jovial and lighthearted. Of course, she's only 4 here, so she didn't know what was coming. These spontaneous and playful smiles came rare as she grew more self-conscious and cautious about how she presented herself to others. And one of the hallmarks of her self-portraiture, as you may have noticed, is that she never shows her teeth, and she's very self-conscious about her smile. And it's not until later, and sometimes in photographs, that you actually see her smiling. Later, in pictures of her adolescence, we see her self-awareness and her self-fashioning in front of the lens, skills that she later defined in her many self-portraits. Behind the camera, Guillermo gave Frida the freedom to explore different identities and gender nonconformity. As a student at the National Preparatory School in Mexico City, Kahlo became part of a circle of young men who called themselves Las Cachuchas, a reference to the caps they wore. The all-male group made an exception by including her. Kahlo chose to wear clothes resembling theirs, and it helped to differentiate herself from the few female peers at school. Even at home, however, in a family portrait, Frida was flouting gender roles. Here she wears her father's 3-piece suit. And I think it says a lot about her father that he gave her the freedom, even in a formal portrait, to pose that way. And perhaps her mother is amused by it, but I don't think her uncle was. While androgyny was trendy in European artistic circles of the 1920s, her self-fashioning was radical in Mexico at the time. The gaze is also the look of someone who has just been through unspeakable trauma. On September 17, 1925, Kahlo was riding home to Coyoacan with her boyfriend and classmate Alejandro Gomez Arias when a trolley car collided into their bus. Kahlo suffered extensive injuries, including a fractured spine, broken ribs, a collarbone, dislocated shoulder, and crushed right foot, and multiple fractures in her right leg. Doctors did not expect her to survive. And I often think about this, about the first responders on that scene, and what a gift they have given us by choosing to save her, because in a triage situation, it must have looked incredibly dire. In this delicate, on the 1-year anniversary of the accident, Kahlo used art to look back on this event that would irrevocably alter her life. In a delicate pencil drawing, Kahlo illustrates the event. She executed the scene with lines that are at once trembling and confident, like pieces of a memory that return after trauma. Her figure lies bandaged in the foreground on a stretcher inscribed Red Cross. The accident took the lives of several other riders, and she shows their bodies strewn in the background. People almost grieving over those bodies. Kahlo depicts the actual collision with graphic detail, noting the perpendicular point of contact between the two vehicles. Perhaps the most devastating detail of the drawing is the mangled piece of iron floating in the bus, right here. This alludes to the worst of her injuries, a piece of an iron handrail that pierced her body, entering through her abdomen and exiting her pelvis. As Kahlo's biography, Hayden Herrera, notes, the accident is what led Kahlo to become a mature painter. Before the accident, Kahlo wanted to study medicine and become a doctor. Afterwards, during the long months of recuperation, she was forced to lie in bed, completely still and mostly alone. I paint myself, Kahlo would later say, because I'm so often alone. I am the subject I know best. A mirror was installed over the bed, and her family fashioned an easel for her to paint while lying in bed. As painting, as Herrera would note, was part of Kahlo's battle for life. It was an act of self-creation and a way to control her world. I would also note, as an aside, that I don't think this ambition to become a doctor or study medicine ever truly left her, because as she was recuperating, as she went through several spinal surgeries, as she suffered a miscarriage later in her life, she always had the need to understand what medically was happening to her and to draw these, to illustrate it with almost the precision of a medical illustrator. Her first self-portrait represents a turning point for Frida, and it is the first painting, this is the first painting that you see in the exhibition that is by Frida Kahlo. The announcement of her new artistic ambitions also meant leaving behind her life from before the accident. In Self-Portrait in a Velvet Dress, painted after her accident, about a year into her recuperation, she is already using costume, posture, gaze, and a moody background to claim control over her circumstances. Compared to her father's photographic portrait, on which this painting is partially based, Kahlo positioned her figure closer to the viewer. Her gaze is more direct and confrontational, yet she accentuates the curves of her neck, highlighting her sensual presence. Kahlo elongated her neck with a plunging neckline, and her hand, somewhat awkwardly large, is pushed to the foreground, as if she's insisting on that symbol of an artist's creativity. In this portrait, Kahlo is truly declaring herself as a serious artist, referencing a sophisticated combination of art historical references, both Mannerist and Renaissance painting. She would actually call this painting her Botticelli, in reference to those elongated fingers which she looked to the Birth of Venus as an example. And also modernist influences, looking to Art Nouveau and contemporary German Weimar portraiture. And just as a side note, I often think about what strength it must have taken for her to sit upright for her father's portrait at this time. She's looking very glamorous and very strong, but also it must have been extraordinarily painful. She gifted this painting to Alejandro after a long separation. During her recuperation, she wrote to him frequently, begging him to come see her. Unfortunately, he began to pull away from her during this time, as his family disapproved of his connection to her, and worrying that he would be saddled with caring for a disabled wife, they sent him off to Germany. Brokenhearted, Frida wrote to him, "Within a few days, the portrait will be at your house. Forgive me for not sending it with a frame. I implore you to put it at a low place as though you were looking at me." She seems to suggest here that he could see her through the painting and she see him, as though almost like a portal that stretched across time and space. She painted a portrait of Alejandro for herself to act as almost a long-distance pendant, so it seems, as she hung onto this painting of her first love until the end of her life. The inscription, added decades later, reads, "Alex, with love, I painted your portrait, my old comrade forever, Frida Kahlo, 1952, 30 years later." And yes, her math is a little wrong there. Kahlo famously said, "There have been two great accidents in my life. One was the trolley, and the other was Diego. Diego was by far the worst." By all accounts, it was a relationship of passion and partnership in art, but also fraught with disappointment and infidelities. They married, separated, divorced, and remarried over a period that lasted from Frida's early 20s until she died at the age of 47. Kahlo first saw Diego Rivera in 1922 while a student at the National Preparatory School, but they did not meet officially until 1928 when she asked him to critique her paintings. Now, think about the confidence that and just guts that it took for her as a 19, 20-year-old to approach Diego Rivera, who at this time was just a art megastar, both in Mexico and also internationally. Frida and Diego's courtship after this progressed rapidly, and to the dismay of her parents, they were married on August 21st, 1929. After living a few months in Coyoacan, they embarked on a trip to California where Diego was commissioned to paint fresco murals. Soon after this, he was invited to Detroit to paint murals at the Detroit Institute of Art. And after a brief stay in New York City, Frida Kahlo found herself living in Michigan by 1932. Oh, and I just want to pause and mention this wonderful portrait that she painted of the two couple almost melded into one. This is very much how she saw them as a couple. They were almost organically bound together. We see two halves of each of their faces to create one whole. We see the contrasts between them. He has kind of a slight smile. She's very serious. And their face is woven together by a network of roots or maybe veins. And this is what I mean about her interest in kind of medical illustration. If we look at their face, it kind of creates the shape of an anatomical heart, and these veins sort of show them organically bound together. Frida sat for portraits by Imogen Cunningham during these years. And again, we see her familiarity with being in front of a camera. She displays her characteristic projection of strength and vulnerability. Although her costume at this stage is rather sedate, she's wearing a woven rebozo and her hair is pulled back straight. She predominantly dons a jade necklace with a central Aztec glyph of a sun, which I think you can see if you look very closely. This is a piece of jewelry gifted by Diego, which would appear in many of her painted self-portraits. This is one of my favorite pieces of press that she got when she was in Detroit. And I think it says a lot about the predicament she found herself when she was following Diego to these various different mural commissions. I would not describe Frida Kahlo at any point as gleeful. And of course, there's this patronizing tone about how she gleefully dabbles in art. I think seeing this really gave her a realization that she needed a strategy to carve out her own autonomy when she was with Diego. And one thing that's very interesting is I kind of imagine a male feature editor looking at this picture in this article and giving it the headline, whereas Florence Davis, who was the reporter, seemed to understand the situation Frida Kahlo was in and quotes her as saying, "No," she explained, "I did not study with Diego. I did not study with anyone. I just started to paint." Then her eyes began to twinkle. "Of course," she explains, "he does pretty well for a little boy. But it is I who am the big artist." So I think she really here is understanding the trail that she has to blaze ahead and how she's going to start pulling herself out and creating an identity for herself. Now, one thing we've been able to do in this exhibition is to put her images of her and by her side by side with some moving pictures. And here we see her in Detroit in 1932 as Diego is working on the scaffolding. And it's so interesting to see her, whenever she's caught by the camera, she sort of gestures to the cameraman saying, look at Diego, as if to say, he's the focus, I'm not in control. And during this time, Frida became very close to a friend named Lucien Bloch, and that's just a lovely installation shot, and you can see how this wonderful shell-encrusted, icon-like image kind of glows in this space. During this time, she became very close to the Swiss-American painter and sculptor Lucien Bloch, who acted as an assistant to Diego on the Detroit murals. A constant companion to Frida, she was with her during her traumatic miscarriage in 1932. And afterwards, she accompanied her on a train to Mexico to recuperate and to tend to her mother, who was close to death. Bloch's photographs of Frida reveal a rare, more intimate view of the artist in a candid moment as they traveled back down to Mexico. And I was looking at this earlier and thinking, this really reminds me of a Hopper painting, looking out in this kind of forlorn way. Bloch's photographs of Frida reveal a rare, more intimate side of the artist. And we also have, sort of coincidentally, but a nice coincidence, a newly acquired painting by Lucien Bloch that shows that she really was influenced by Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo at this moment. And this painting by Lucien Bloch of 1948 is on view in the American galleries right now. The painting that best proclaims Frida Kahlo's construction of identity is perhaps My Dress Was Hanging There, a painting with collage elements that I'll talk about in a moment down here, that she started in 1933 but finished as late as 1938. So it kind of bookends her two trips, very important trips to New York, one in 33 when she was with Diego Rivera, and 1938 when she returned for her own reasons to New York. Between these two trips, her marriage to Diego had grown strained, especially after learning that Diego was having an affair with her sister and best friend, Christina. She traveled to New York on the invitation of Julian Levy, the Surrealist gallery owner and photographer, who staged Kahlo's first one-person exhibition in November of that year at his New York gallery on East 57th Street. This painting is Kahlo's scathing indictment of American culture in the 1930s. Kahlo began to work on this immediately following the international upheaval surrounding the destruction of her husband's Rockefeller Center mural. Angry about the anti-communist debacle, she used this urban landscape to highlight the United States' hypocrisies. Kahlo emphasized the nonsensical nature of social norms in the United States by juxtaposing elements from high and low culture. For example, the Mae West billboard in front of Trinity Church. It's an interesting juxtaposition here, and also a toilet, by the way. The Tijuana dress, which represents her and her own background, is suspended on columns holding a toilet and a trophy in the central foreground, and kind of suggests her yearning to return to Mexico, but also really, I think, poignantly points out her absence in the midst of all of this, as though she doesn't feel at home here. There is so much to unpack in the background, but this Tijuana dress is very central. Tijuana dress would become her signature look after her first trip to the United States. As I said, I think at that time she started to really feel the need to define herself against against her circumstances. In the early days of her marriage and her first week travels with Diego, Kahlo's style was a mixture of Mexican and European styles, accented with Aztec jewelry, such as the Imogene Cunningham portrait. But at the end of her time in the US, she had adopted a more colorful Tijuana dresses, both in her paintings and in public. As she spent more time in the US, often feeling out of place and homesick, Frida began to dress to stand out from the art-world luminaries that she found distasteful and elitist. The dress hangs on a clothesline suspended above all that disgusted her in New York at the time. And it's remarkable the precision with which she renders the hallmarks of American institutions that she had come to despise. American finance is Federal Hall, which was the sub-treasury building, in a Trinity Church downtown. If you look very closely, you can see that there's a snake that wraps around the cross that turns the cross into a dollar sign. And in pop culture is embodied by a tattered billboard of Mae West as Klondike Annie in a 1936 film. Finally, American industry, which if you think about it, occupies a lot of this canvas, is represented here. And I believe this is encapsulated by Havemeyer's Domino Sugar Refinery across the river in Williamsburg, Brooklyn. And I think this really was important to her because the factory was a place of of worker activism, and I think she really related to that. Below, Kahlo added collage elements from contemporary journals of crowds of common people, protesting, processing, and standing in bread lines, spanning the newly constructed George Washington Bridge. Frida hangs her dress above the masses to show her sympathy for the common working people suffering during the Great Depression against the backdrop of the towering institutions that caused their misery. This painting was included in the Julie Levy exhibition, which opened on November 15, 1938. Levy and Kahlo became close and possibly lovers at this time, and the exhibition was a proclamation of Kahlo as a serious artist independent from her husband, aligned with an international network of surrealists led by Andre Breton and Julian Levy. The pamphlet for this exhibition identified Kahlo with her own name on her insistence, and with her married name parenthetically noted on Levy's and Breton's assistance. An essay penned by Andre Breton accompanied the catalog, and the last line of the essay perfectly encapsulated Kahlo's subversiveness. The paintings of Frida Kahlo are a ribbon tied around a bomb. Despite her hope to be taken seriously, some critics, such as the Time magazine reviewer, still seemed to me to mock her, who, despite alluding to Breton's powerful metaphor, used a patronizing tone to disparage her, both her gender and her Mexican identity, referring to her as little, and that her work is the playful, bloody fancy of an unsentimental child, intuiting that her work is more intuitive than intellectual. About this time, Kahlo was learning to use her stunning beauty, fashion, and confidence in front of the camera to widen her own public reach, and she was featured in a few American periodicals. She dominated a Vogue magazine spread in 1937 entitled The Senoras of Mexico, and I should say that there were about half a dozen senoras in this feature, but she was the only one who got a double spread and color photography. Tony Frisell, who was a war correspondent, was the photographer for this and has an incredible sheet of negatives that I've been able to see. These magazines have been collected and are on view in a case outside of our library. One of the people that Kahlo met through the Levy exhibition was Claire Booth Luce, the managing editor of Vanity Fair. Luce was close friends with Dorothy Hale, a film and stage actress who had recently committed suicide by jumping from the 16th floor window of her apartment building in New York. Frida had also known Hale and suggested to Luce that she commission a recuerdo, or remembrance. Luce thought that this meant a posthumous portrait and thought it would be a nice gift for Hale's mother. Instead of a portrait along the lines of the several depictions, the self-portraits she had seen at the Levy show, Kahlo painted a graphic illustration of Hale's fall to her death called The Suicide of Dorothy Hale. In it, we see 3 moments of falling from the 16th floor. You see her here, then floating through the clouds, and then finally dead in a pool of blood, which drips down on the frame to create an inscription in Spanish. In the city of New York, on the 21st day of October at 6 o'clock in the morning, Mrs. Dorothy Hale committed suicide by throwing herself out of a very high window of the Hampshire House building. This retablos was painted in her memory by Frida Kahlo. Once again, Kahlo is precise with the details. Her text and image seems to be drawn directly from the headlines reporting her death. It was widely reported, as Hale was rumored to be, and here is one of the many articles front page articles, by the way, that described her death. Most reports inferred that the breakup in the relationship from Harry Hopkins, who was a WPA board administrator and a close political advisor to Roosevelt, this was the reason for the suicide. Papers also noted that she was found wearing a black velvet dress and wearing a corsage of tea roses, which Luce later said were given to her by the artist Isamu Noguchi. Kahlo was also careful to describe the architecture of the Hampshire House. As with my dresses hanging there, the accurate depiction of architecture seemed a device for Kahlo to explore a devastating truth. Luce was horrified by the painting, as you can imagine, which she had intended to give to Hale's mother, but later realized that it was a cultural misunderstanding, not knowing what a recuerdo or remembrance was. Similar to a retablos painting, this is a tradition that goes back centuries in Mexican art, such as this one here, this example at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. This painting illustrates the story of a miracle. According to the account written in Spanish beneath the painting, when the balcony started to collapse, the young woman invoked the spirit of the Holy Mary. As a result, Mary's divine powers prevented any harm to the young woman or a baby. This type of narrative, or an ex voto or retablo, was commissioned after a tragic event in thanks or in grief, and was common in Mexico and many Latin American countries, but clearly not understood by a white upper-class New York audience. I think that Kahlo knew exactly what she was doing when she suggested the commission to Luce and anticipated the reaction. Perhaps Kahlo saw another way to highlight her Mexican identity while also casting a disparaging light on New York society. Indeed, Luce was shocked by the graphic portrayal, and several of her friends had to convince her not to destroy it. Instead, Luce's name as the commissioner of the painting was removed and covered by white paint. And that's what you see here. Also on view in this gallery is the introduction of Aztec sculpture that she and Diego collected and was an important inspiration for her throughout her life in her art. And we've been fortunate to include some of the examples from our collection in the installation here at the VMFA. In some cases, Kahlo had accomplices in her project to create an impenetrable persona. Nicholas Murray was a Hungarian-born photographer who would become one of the most successful commercial photographers of the 20th century, not to mention an accomplished fencer who competed in the 1928 and 1932 Olympics. In 1931, the Mexican artist Miguel Covarrubias introduced Murray to Kahlo. Their attraction was mutual and immediate, and resulted in a decade-long affair. Murray's photographs of Kahlo remain some of the most arresting and beautiful portraits of the artist, and his images of Frida through the mid-30s through the 1940s, his images cemented her status as a cultural icon. Keeping in mind their relationship, it's also possible to see how Murray's camera captured Kahlo's admiration and affection for the man on the other side of the lens. More than that, Murray's portraits really seem to be directed by Kahlo herself, reflecting the aspects of her own self-portraits, the posture, the gaze, the fashion, the hairstyles, and the accessories. Here's just an example. You can see that many of his photographic self-portraits actually almost read as photographic versions of Frida Kahlo self-portraits herself. Here they are together, We see their very close relationship. And also with a photograph that's been added to the exhibition called Frida Kahlo with an Olmeca figurine. Again, her posing with these sculptures in her collection. In the VMFA collection exhibition, we've also been able to show his 16mm films of Frida and Rivera at the Casa Azul. And they display a photographer's experimentation with a moving image, and also, perhaps unintentionally on Mireille's part, but very intentionally on Frida's part, the incredible triangulation of seductive glances of a woman juggling two lovers. And you'll see in just a moment that, remember, Nicholas Murray is behind the camera, and she's flirting with Diego on camera. I also think it's a great example of how natural she is in front of the camera, and just how awkward he is with his pants pulled up over his waist. I think she knew exactly what she was doing. I also love that she's put down her cigarette over here, so it looks like the jaguar is smoking from his mouth. I'll just get one more second. These projections, I really, in combination with her work, I think really serve to show, really bring her to life in this space, especially as someone who's known for a very still, composed posture. And also, in this section, we have given you the opportunity to put yourself in the place of a Frida Kahlo image with this wonderful photo opportunity, reproducing the wallpaper from this iconic image. A comparison of two self-portraits in the exhibition, one earlier than the other, show how Kahlo's strategy changed in her projection of identity. Early in her career, she strengthened herself after the accident with art historical references, but in her last self-portraits, she seems almost resolved to lean into her pain. Kahlo shows herself stripped of adornment and artifice. Her hair is uncombed. She seems exhausted and resigned. Especially in this portrait, self-portrait with loose hair, she referred to this as the beginning of the end. No makeup or jewelry, her entire identity is presented through her expression and her signature Tehuana dress, providing only color in an otherwise bleak background. In this other portrait, the one on the left, we also see, again, about the same time, we also see her leaning into kind of a support network of supporting characters, especially her little monkey, Fu Lang Chu, that kind of duplicates her gaze. And I love that they both have the same ribbon in their hair. As much as there was struggle during this time, there was also joy. We see her again having moments with her close female friends. And one thing that I think is really nice that we've been able to add to this exhibition, thanks to the generosity of Spencer Throckmorton, is an authentic example of her costume. And we see this lovely embroidered blouse with a deer and flower patterns that she was known for. This exuberant floral still life, Magnolias, is also on view. This painting has not left Mexico in 50 years, so it's a real treat to be able to see this painting, which is absolutely pristine. It was inspired by Georgia O'Keeffe's paintings, and it may refer to the shared suffering and struggle to find strength and creativity that Frida identified with O'Keeffe. Kahlo and O'Keeffe first met during Diego Rivera's retrospective exhibit at MoMA in 1931, and the women had much in common. They were both married to older and famous men, and both struggled to define themselves against the mostly male-dominated modernism of the early 20th century. Their relationship included mutual admiration and sympathy. And when O'Keeffe was hospitalized in 1933 for a mental health crisis and instructed by doctors not to paint for a year, Kahlo wrote a letter expressing her affection and sympathy for her health concerns. And bear with me, I have to read a bit of this letter because it's just so beautiful. Please, Georgia dear, if you can't write, ask Stieglitz to do it for you and let me how you are feeling, will you? I will be in Detroit 2 more weeks. I would like to tell you everything that has happened to me since the last time we saw each other, but most of them are sad, and you mustn't know sad things now. She had just suffered a miscarriage. After all, I shouldn't complain because I have been happy in many ways, though. Diego is good to me, and you can't imagine how happy he has been working on the frescoes here. I have been painting a little too, and that helped. I thought of you a lot, and never forget your wonderful hands and the color of your eyes. Kahlo's painting evokes O'Keeffe's signature close observation of flowers, but unlike O'Keeffe's white flower, open and in full bloom, Kahlo's magnolias are still in bud stage. These ones here and here. In the center of the arrangement is a large pear cactus flower. This flower is extremely sensitive when it bloomed, and the blossom only lasts a few hours. In Mexico, these opuntia cacti are known as nopal, derived from the Nahuatl for prickly pear. The Aztecs would use the juice from this cactus to treat burns and other ailments, and they considered it sacred. The pear cactus and its fruit is a representation of life and death in many of Frida Kahlo's still life paintings. And here we see it in this gallery with, again, this lovely projection. In the last years of Kahlo's life, as her health deteriorated, she increasingly turned to still life as a primary source of expression, and they account for over half of her artistic production during this period. The various subjects were always close at hand and could be explored as her strength allowed. She imbued each element with personal meaning. And here we see at work on Naturaleza Viva while she's in bed. And I think it's really interesting that the name for still life in Spanish is Naturaleza Muerta, but she calls this Naturaleza Viva, as if to show that it is life-fulfilling. And you'll see that these fruits, rather than being just on a table, are actually being grown from the roots from the ground. The artist appreciated that she didn't have to worry about her appearance when painting still life, and so her imagination could lead the way. They also permitted her to express her growing anxiety about death in a symbolic, more secretive manner that allowed potential buyers to view them simply as pleasing compositions, such as this one. The painting, Still Life, I Belong to Samuel Faslicht, actually refers to the painting belonged to Dr. Faslicht, who was her dentist. She painted this still life in lieu of a payment to him. And he also became an important figure in her life because she, as I said, she was always self-conscious about her teeth, and he was helping her with that. But I also think perhaps he was helping her with pain management. Here, the objects in the composition express her identity as a Mexican flag through the flag and the native vegetation, and as a sensual creature through the ripe and voluptuous fruit. She planted a small note in the melon at the right, declaring, "I belong to Samuel Faslicht." And I think many scholars have pointed out that this piercing of a fruit often can refer back to her being impaled on her original accident. In gratitude, this note was placed in gratitude to her doctor. She depicts ripened fruits and vegetables arranged around a clay figurine of a Colima dog. Both Frida and Diego, as I said, collected pre-Columbian art, particularly the ancient sculpture of Western Mexico. It's highly naturalistic and playful, such as this example that we have in our own collection that's on view in the galleries. Many pre-Columbian cultures believed that dogs guided the dead through the underworld and the afterlife. And as Frida neared the end of her life, dogs appeared more frequently in her paintings and her drawings. She owned several Mexican hairless dogs. And these are the same type, but maybe the descendants of the dogs that we see in the Colima sculpture. Here, Kahlo portrays her favorite pet, El Señor Xolotl, with its wings in accordance to pre-Hispanic myth. As befits his name, her dog is presented as Xolotl, or the evening star, the twin brother of Quetzalcoatl, the morning star, who accompanies the sun during its nighttime journey through the underworld. The two deities represent the harmonies of opposites in Mesoamerican thought. And here's Frida with two of her dogs. Maybe one of them is Mr. Xochotl, I don't know. Taken by her friend, Lola Alvarez Bravo, who photographed Frida several times at the end of her life and seemed to understand the importance of the mirror in Frida's practice. As with Lucien Bloch early on, Kahlo let down her guard in front of Bravo's lens. The photographer recalled this image many years later, saying that it was unplanned. When Kahlo approached the mirror, Alvarez Bravo encouraged her to move closer to reflection, saying, "Suddenly, I said yes, 2 Fridas." Lola Alvarez Bravo also caught Frida Kahlo reflected in the mirror over her bed. And if you look closely, there's her dog. And this is the reflection that allowed her to pursue art during her long recuperation and painted her way towards a tool for survival. In her last years, and after another spinal surgery in 1949, Kahlo was hospitalized 9 months and relied on a wheelchair for mobility. She spent increasing time in bed, either at home or in the hospital. In 1953, Kahlo had a triumphant first solo show in Mexico, but was forced to attend the opening carried in on a bed. Months later, it became necessary to amputate her right leg. Her last public appearance was in a protest demonstration in early July, and 11 days afterwards, she died at home on July 13th, 1954. And here is this lovely path towards the end of the exhibition that was designed for this exhibition, designed for the end, in which we see gold marigold arches, or meant to evoke the gold marigold arches that often are led to an altarpiece. And at the end, or rather to an altar to a person, and at the end, which I won't show you close up, is the death portrait of Frida Kahlo by Lola Alvarez Bravo. Frida Kahlo's paintings are a testament to an artist whose performed identity was perhaps her greatest work of art. The mythology that surrounded her was one of her own creation, a strategy to channel her survival skills through painting, but also to forge an armor that protected her against dependency on others, the sexism and bigotry of the art world, and even physical pain. Through a close examination of her work, mindful of the significant events of her life that impacted her subject matter, and with the help of photographs taken of her by close friends and family, we can perhaps go beyond the mythology of Frida Kahlo, or at least understand the brilliance of its construction. Thank you so much.